As the U.S. changes dramatically its policies, and that's the right of the United States, as it changes those policies, many of our former strengths have become our vulnerabilities. We still, to be clear, we still have the best trade deal with the United States. Over 85% of our goods move tariff-free across the border. But with American tariffs, so-called 232 or strategic tariffs on autos, steel, aluminum, forest products, I could go on, but in these so-called strategic areas, those are creating deep challenges for our workers and firms in those industries, industries that until now had been highly, highly integrated with the United States to the benefit of America as well as Canada. And our response begins by reimagining aspects of North American integration. And to be absolutely clear, Canada, like Mexico, Canada remains open to deeper integration, including options for Fortress North America in selected sectors. And to be clear, those offers are on the table. But if that route is not ultimately possible, we will invest heavily in new markets and products. We'll reward those who build, buy, and produce in Canada, and we will build new partnerships abroad. We're already applying the main lessons of the past 18 months, that we must build our strategic autonomy.
Mark Carney delivered a speech this week that no Canadian Prime Minister has delivered in the modern era of the bilateral relationship with the United States. Not in its tone, not in its direction, not in the specific admission at its center that the proximity to the American economy, which Canada celebrated and depended on for generations, has now become a strategic vulnerability, not a trade dispute, not a negotiating inconvenience, a vulnerability. That word, spoken publicly by a sitting Canadian Prime Minister, represents a fundamental reorientation of how Ottawa now describes its relationship with Washington. And the rest of the speech, built carefully around that admission in ways that anyone paying attention to the future of North American geopolitics should be reading with care. Carney stated it plainly: Canada has long benefited from its proximity to the world's largest and most dynamic economy, he said, and was genuinely grateful for that. But as the United States changes its policies dramatically, which is Washington's sovereign right, many of Canada's former strengths have become its vulnerabilities. He was direct about which strengths those were: the deep integration of Canadian auto, steel, aluminum, and forest product industries with American supply chains and American markets integration that had been celebrated as a model of North American cooperation and mutual prosperity has been converted into exposure by the tariff regime that Washington has imposed on all of those sectors simultaneously. This is a historic shift in public framing. For decades, the Canada-US relationship was treated by Canadian leaders as the foundational pillar of national economic strategy, not to be subjected to the kind of risk assessment language that Carney deployed in this speech. You do not publicly describe proximity to your most important partner as a vulnerability unless the evidence for that description has become impossible to frame otherwise. The 50% tariff on Canadian steel, the 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum, the auto tariffs are inconsistent with CUSMA's own side letters, the forest products duty stacked on top of years of softwood lumber disputes. Carney's language did not exaggerate the situation. It described it accurately in terms that Canadian diplomatic convention had previously avoided. The speech then pivoted to what Canada is doing about it, and this is where the strategic content becomes most significant. Carney outlined a dual-track approach that is simultaneously an offer and a contingency. The offer is still on the table, he said. Canada remains open to deeper North American integration, including what he described as Fortress North America options in selected strategic sectors. Including what he described as Fortress North America options in selected strategic sectors. Those offers have been made. They are available. But if that route is not ultimately possible, and this is the critical conditional, Canada will invest heavily in new markets, reward those who build and produce domestically, and build new partnerships across the rest of the world. That conditional sentence is the diplomatic bombshell. A Canadian Prime Minister has publicly told the United States, on the record, that Canada is preparing for a future in which America may no longer behave like a reliable partner, and that Canada is not waiting for that future to arrive before building the alternatives that would make it survivable. That is not the language of a country reacting from weakness. It is the language of a country that has spent 18 months building leverage and is now prepared to articulate what it will use that leverage for. The numbers Carney cited are not aspirational projections. Foreign investment in Canada is at its highest level in 2 decades, running at more than twice the rate adjusted for economic size of all other G7 economies combined. Non-US exports are up sharply, and Canada is on track to double them within the decade. 20 new economic and security agreements have been signed across 5 continents in the past year. Major trade agreements with India, ASEAN, and Mercosur are in progress. The Canada Strong Sovereign Wealth Fund has been established. The $500 billion defense and security investment over the next decade has been committed, representing the first time since the fall of the Berlin Wall that Canada is meeting its NATO obligations. $500 billion of investment in defense and security and resilience, Carney said. That is not a campaign promise. It is a budget commitment. The section of the speech that carries the most geopolitical weight in terms of how it will be read in Washington is the philosophical framing around sovereignty in the modern world. Carney argued that sovereignty in the current era requires more than a country being able to feed, fuel, and defend itself, though all of those are essential. It requires access to critical minerals, space-based communications, sovereign cloud infrastructure, artificial intelligence systems, payment networks,